All right, so today we are going to start talking about putting numbers into different categories. And to do that, it's called our RIW circle. So we can kind of think of it kind of like a Venn diagram. So we're going to start in the middle and work our way out. So the first kind of numbers that we're going to talk about today are our whole numbers. Our whole numbers. These are our regular counting numbers that you learned very first off. So these must be positive. Let's put a positive sign there. Must be positive. So we got positive signs on both sides. They must be positive. So if they're negative, it's not a whole number. Also, they cannot no fractions or decimals. We cannot have fractions or decimals if it's a whole number. So for it to be a whole number, it must be positive, so no negatives, and we can't have fractions or decimals. So let's look at an example. So if I have, say, the number 3, doesn't have to have the positive sign, so it's positive. It doesn't have a fraction or a decimal, so 3 is a regular whole number. Again, whole numbers are just our counting numbers, 1 through whatever it is. But another way that we can see it is another one we could think of as 5. That's a whole number. It's positive, doesn't have a fraction or a decimal. I could even do something like 0. Positive, no fractions or decimals. But what if I do this? So it says no fractions or decimals, but it's 0.0. So technically that 0.0 doesn't even really count. So I can just think of that as 115. So just because it has a 0.0, it can still be a whole decimal or a whole number, because you can think of that as a whole number, just regular 115. The next one is we could do something like 4 over 1. We've talked about whole numbers go over 1. So if it's something over 1, this can still be counted as a whole number. And lastly, I could do something like 8 over 4. But again, it says, oh, no fractions. But if I divide 8 over 4, that really equals 2. So if you have a fraction, you might have to divide it and see if it really does equal a whole number, because 8 divided by 4 is 2, which is technically a whole number. Okay? The next thing I want to point out is that if I have a whole number, such as our 5 or something like that, if it's a whole number, it's also part of this circle and the outer circle. So we'll talk about that a little bit more in a second, but just remember, we start from the middle and then we go out. Okay? So the next type of numbers we're going to talk about are integers, which you should be familiar with that term. We've been using integers since the beginning of the year so far. So whole numbers were positive. Integers can be positive or negative, which we know that integers are our positive and negative numbers. So these are the numbers on our number line. So for example, we could do, let's see here, we could do negative 13, negative 21. We could still have our positives as well, so we could have like our 3 still works in here, because again, if you're in the middle, you're also a part of this outer ring. I forgot also, in integers we have no fractions or decimals. Still no fractions or decimals. So we changed from positives to positives and negatives, but there's still no fractions or decimals in integers. So now we can involve our negatives though. So if I have any of these examples, like if I have an integer like negative 21, it's part of my outer ring as well. It's not a whole number because we can't go backwards, but it is my outer ring. We always go outwards because negative 21 can't be a whole number because it's a negative and they can only be positive. Lastly, the last type of numbers we have are rational numbers. So this one's new. Rational numbers, you've already been working with them, you just didn't know what they were called. So rational numbers, again, can be positive or negative. So that's the same as integers. They can be positive or negative. But the difference is this is where our fractions and decimals come into play. So if it has a fraction or a decimal, it's automatically a rational number. Okay, so if I do an example such as 4 1/6, it has a fraction, so it's automatically a rational number. It can't be an integer because we can't have fractions or decimals, and it can't be a whole because no fractions. So it's only a rational number. If I have, let's see here, if I have like 5.4, it's decimal, so it goes all the way out here. It can't be an integer because we can't have decimals. It can't be a whole number because we can't have decimals. And then if I just have a regular fraction such as like 1/3, so it mixed number, this one's a fraction, but it's still a fraction, so I can't be an integer or a whole number. And lastly, there's nowhere for it to go. We can't go into any outer rings. So if it's a rational, it's only a rational number. If it's a whole number, it can also be a whole number, an integer, and rational. If it's an integer, it can be an integer and rational. Rationals are just rationals. We move outwards in our circle, not inwards.